The first thing I need to figure out is what functionality in this directive I'm going to test. The directive itself is rather simple. There's no code inside of the directive. The meat of it is inside of the template. So let's look at that template. You can see that the template does two main things. It renders a bunch of data and it hooks up a click event. So I'm going to write two different tests, one that tests that the directive was rendered correctly, and one that tests that the directive wires up the click event correctly. Now, of course, before I start the process of testing, I'm going to want to start up my Karma server so that I can see when my tests are passing or failing. After waiting for that to go, I can see that all 8 of my tests are passing, and now I'm ready to add more tests. So first I'll write the test that verifies that the directive has been rendered correctly. Now, since I haven't written any of the code that's actually going to make this directive run, I'm not exactly sure what kind of variables I'm going to have available to me. But I know that in the end, all I'm going to be doing is verifying that some DOM nodes are correct. So I'm going to assume that I have a pointer to a DOM node, and I'm going to call that EL for element. And I'm going to grab its text property, and I'm going to check that that text property contains a certain text string. Now I know that my directive prints out the name of the event, so I'm going to add in the string event name. And I'm going to make that the name of my test event that I'm going to test this directive with. Now if I save this file, my tests are going to run and they're going to fail because there's no EL variable. Now it's time for me to start setting up to test my directive. I'll start by creating the EL variable, and I'm still getting errors. Next I'll add in the module that this directive is part of. Now the next piece isn't obvious, but it's very important. I need to tell Angular that I want it to load up the template that this directive uses. And I do that in a very similar manner that I loaded up the module. But now, instead of giving it the name of the module, I'm going to give it the path to that template. Now, of course, this test still isn't going to pass because I'm not actually creating and running that directive. So we're going to create another before each function, and inside this one we're going to put in all of our setup code that creates and runs the directive. Again, I use the inject function so that Angular will provide me the things that I need. In this case, I need two things. The first one is a compiler, and the second one is a root scope object so that I can have a scope object to test with. Now within this before each function, I need to do two things. First, I need to set up the scope, and secondly, I need to create and compile the directive. Let's set up the scope first. I'm just creating a variable here with a more convenient name to use as I set up the scope. Now if I go back to my template, I can see that all the bindings are against an object named event on the scope. So I'll go back to my scope and I'll create an event object. Now that event object needs several different properties that Angular is going to bind into that template. It needs a name, and I'm going to use the name event name, which is what I asserted in my test. It also needs a date. I'm just going to put in a random string here and for the rest of the values. Then a time and a location, and this is an object that has an address and a city and a province. Okay, so now I've got my scope set up. So far this code's been fairly straightforward. Now it's time to create and compile our directive. First, I'll create a detached DOM node and put it into the EL variable. Remember, the Angular element function is really just a wrapper around jQuery. Now I've got to put in the HTML that matches my directive. Okay, that line of code is going to create a detached DOM node inside of that EL variable that has an element named event thumbnail. Now that I've got that DOM node created, I've got to tell Angular to compile that DOM node and apply the scope. And I do that by calling the compile function that I injected into this before each, and I pass in the element, and that will create a getter function. Now I call that getter function and pass in the scope. Doing that will take the scope and the element, compile the element, and apply the scope to it. And then I need to do one last thing to get Angular to take the results of this compilation process and apply them against my element. And that's calling digest on the scope. This call tells Angular to update the HTML. Now let's save this, and that'll run our test. And we can see that the test is now passing. Now let's talk for just a quick second about troubleshooting. Let's say, for example, that you had misspelled your directive and accidentally put a 2 on the end. When I save this, my test is going to fail. And assuming I hadn't noticed the misspelling, I want to know why that's failing. There's a very easy technique you can use to test whether or not your directive is getting correctly compiled. We just go down after the digest and add in a line that logs out the HTML. Remember the EL is going to be a jQuery object, so I'm going to grab the first DOM node within that set and ask for its outer HTML property. Now when I save that, I can come down into the output and scroll up and see what the HTML actually is. And you can see here that the HTML hasn't been compiled. So now I know that something's wrong with the compilation process. That might help me look at my directive and see that I've misspelled it. Then I come down here and click the scroll to the end button and save my test. And now I'm back to passing. Now let's write in our other test. Now in this test I want to check that the binding was correct. In order to test that the binding is correct, I actually want to click the element. So I'm going to call el.click. This will simulate a click on the element and run any click event handlers that are on that element. Now in order to validate that that worked, I need to expect that a stub was called. Going over and looking at my template, I can see that the function it calls is called showDetails. So I'm going to call this stub with that name and check that it was called. Now I need to create that stub. So I'm going to go up to my scope and I'm going to initialize that stub. Now I need this variable here to be visible down inside the test, so I'm going to add this variable up inside my describe. Now I need to wire up my directive and tell it what function to call whenever showDetails is called. So I'll go down into my directive HTML and I'll add in the showDetails attribute. And I'm going to tell it to call a function named myShowDetails. And I'm going to pass in the event to that function. Now the directive is going to expect that there's a method called myShowDetails on the scope. So go back to the scope and create that method. And I've assigned that stub to be that method. Now let's save and see what we get. Alright, all 10 of our tests are passing. And these 2 tests that I added now verify that this directive correctly binds the data and will handle the click event correctly. One small note to make about testing directives. We saw in our controller test that we created a new scope using rootScope.new. In a directive test we can't do that. If I set my scope equal to rootScope.new, my tests are going to fail. Angular's directive testing won't work unless you're using the root scope as your scope. So always be sure to only use the root scope in your directive tests. I fix that and run the tests again, and we're back to green. And that's how we can test directives using Angular's unit testing. It would be a great idea at this time to solidify the things that you have learned by writing your own unit tests for directives. The most convenient way to do that would be to take the source code for this project and add unit tests for the other directives in the project. There's plenty of them, and by the time you've written unit tests for all of them, you'll feel very comfortable with writing unit tests for directives in Angular. Now let's review with a quiz. Why can it be difficult to test directives? There's a couple reasons why testing directives can be difficult. For one, there is a lot of pieces involved, and it's also got some kind of tricky setup, especially if you're using external templates for your directives. What does the HTML to JS preprocessor do? The HTML to JS preprocessor will create JavaScript that will create HTML nodes analogous to the HTML that you feed it. What is the output of calling the compile function? The compile function outputs another function. This is the function you pass the scope object to when you're creating a directive for testing.